Welcome back to your Essentials group on the book of Genesis. My name is David Barr, and I'm one of the clergy here at St. George's, and I'd like to talk to you just a little bit today about Genesis 15. Genesis 15 is probably one of the most pivotal chapters in Genesis, and maybe even in the Bible as a whole. It's the covenant that's made with Abraham, then called Abram. And it's such an important event, not just because it's remembered so often, but because in it we get this glimpse of how God plans to save the human race. And in order to see this, we have to note a kind of sobering truth. Think back on the chapters we've already covered. Remember, we noted the devastating effects of sin on humanity. We looked at the fall, this perfect rupture of communion between God and man. We saw all of its implications. And the humbling truth about this is that God did not have to save the human race. Right? And there are a variety of ways that one could imagine him dealing with this problem of sin. You know, he could start all over. He could force humans to be a certain way. He could even create a whole other group of humans. He can do whatever he wants because he is God. But in Genesis 15, we see that he does in fact want to save us. And then in Genesis 15, we see how he plans to save us, how he plans to solve the problem of sin. And in some ways, you might say that all of God's redemptive work is revealed right here in this one particular relationship that God has with the family of Abraham. And I'll return to this point about particularity in a minute, but first I'd like to talk about a few other things that might be helpful in your discussion. Here's the first one. In chapter 15's context, within the larger narrative of Genesis, we can note the way that Genesis is divided into two parts. Bible scholars often talk about how there's a shift that occurs in the book right around chapter 11. And if you've been reading through all of the chapters, again, not required, you'll notice how in chapters 1 through 11, we see these narratives that are universal in scope. There was creation, and then the fall and the flood. And all of these are about universally significant events, right? And then all of a sudden in chapter 12, it's as if we focus in on this one household. And that happens, of course, when God mysteriously calls Abraham to follow him. And Abraham and his family really remain the focus of Genesis until the end of chapter 50, at the very end. So there are two basic parts to Genesis. There's 1 through 11 and 12 to 50. And chapter 15, of course, is right at the beginning of the second section. Now, it's interesting because we don't know that much about Abraham's background. We don't really know why he's chosen. We don't know where he's from, really. It says Ur of the Chaldees, but no one knows exactly where that is. People speculate maybe present-day Iraq or Turkey. All that we know is he's a descendant of Noah. So he is a son of God's covenant. Now, here's the second contextual issue that's important. The chapters leading up to chapter 15. So in chapters 12 to 14, we see how Abraham's initial call is not without enormous problems. And this is an important detail to rehearse because it shows the way Abraham is not exactly a paradigm of moral perfection. In these chapters, there are a whole number of challenges that Abraham does not respond to well at all. God tells Abraham again to go to Canaan, and he does, but when they get there, there's this famine, so then they all go down to Egypt, and then Abraham makes a host of mistakes down there, and so they all come back to Canaan. But when they get back to Canaan, they find that the whole land is at war. There are these battles between various kingdoms, and Abraham's nephew, you remember his name's Lot, gets taken captive, and so Abraham has to go and rescue him. And so at this point, it looks as if the whole promise that God has made with Abraham is not working out at all. And then comes this really strange but absolutely crucial moment that's in chapter 14, right before our reading. It's after Abraham defeats these enemies and he rescues Lot, his cousin, and he meets with the king of Sodom to settle up on his affairs. And another man shows up named Melchizedek. It says that Melchizedek is both a priest and a king. And there in front of the king of Sodom, Melchizedek blesses Abraham in the name of God Most High. In other words, like the God of all gods. Strange story, but what's going on here is we see this verification of Abraham's call even in the middle of enormous turmoil. And even more than that, this calling we see is verified by an external party because remember, Melchizedek is not an Israelite and he's not a Canaanite. And he affirms that the God of all gods is with Abraham. So, when we enter into chapter 15, we see how God's covenant with Abram is actually an affirmation of a previous promise. In other words, it's a deepening of an already existing commitment that's already been made. And that is revealing because that's in some ways what a covenant is. It is more than a promise. It is a binding public contract that involves consequences if broken. And covenants, you may know, were made all throughout the ancient world and they're made all throughout the Bible. But this covenant is probably the most significant within all of Scripture because of the way it prefigures all of what's to come. Now, here's what we see in this covenant. This is revealing. First, notice how dire these circumstances are. God promises, again, remember, to make Abraham's family great. But you'll recall, he and Sarah cannot have children. And according to the reading, the closest thing they have, this is in the reading, closest thing they have to an heir is Eliezer of Damascus. And Eliezer of Damascus is not a true heir. He's a servant. So they've also just been in battle. Remember that. They've won, of course, but they're not on friendly terms with these neighboring kingdoms. And then also they are totally new to this land. They're newcomers to Canaan. And then in the middle of all of this craziness, God says, look at the stars in the sky. I'll give you that many offspring. And it will come from a son, your son. And Abraham's response is absolutely incredible. In verse 6, it's one of the most famous lines in Genesis. It says, Abram believed the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Abraham believes. You see, God makes a promise that seems absolutely impossible, and Abraham believes it. And this is a key verse that the New Testament takes up later and that the Christian tradition has fixated on for centuries and centuries. And the reason is because what makes Abraham a fitting partner in the covenant that comes in verses 12 to 21 isn't Abraham's strength, it isn't his moral integrity, but his faith. Abraham's belief makes him a righteous participant in the covenant of all covenants. And then the covenant happens, and it's, of course, not in our assigned reading. It's right after our reading, but we see how serious it is. There are these sacrifices made, God's presence descends, and essentially what God is saying is, you see all of this blood, may it be unto me if I don't follow through on my promise. And that is, in fact, a big part of what a covenant is. It's a promise that is so firm that it binds together the fates of the two parties involved. It's as if to say, this promise, I'm good for it. In fact, I will bleed for it. And the way Abraham enters into this covenant is his trust in God. Now, there's one final thing before I end here, and it's this issue, again, I mentioned it earlier, it's this issue of particularity. The covenant is made out of God's own mysterious election of Abraham and his people. And what that means is the whole plan of redemption for the whole world comes through this one family. And that is truly incredible. The plan is that God will establish a beloved people who will represent him and act like him and live out his abundant mercy within the world, who will be bearers of him. And there's a great quote by one theologian. He says this, Abraham is important because God's covenant with him simply is the divine plan. It's not a metaphor for anything. It's not a symbolization. It's not a mediation. God's plan is Abraham. And I want you to know how remarkable that is. Do you see what it means? It means that God doesn't have some principle or theory to redeem the world. He just has a people that he's promised to be with until the end of all things, and they are named, and you can find the first one here in Genesis 15, Abraham. And all of this, I think, should sound abundantly familiar to Christians who worship a God who came down to reestablish his people, to bleed for them, and to claim them as his own, that they then might live out his own righteousness and his own graciousness. So in sum, keep these things in mind as you discuss Genesis 15. First, we've moved into these narratives about the family of Abraham, and all of the rest of Genesis will focus on this family. This is the family of the covenant, the family of God's promise, the plan for all of salvation. Second, Abraham is not a moral exemplar, but he does give an example of faith, and he will do it again. And then third, finally, God's covenant relationship with this particular people is his plan of redemption. And so we see that the gospel is not a concept, but it's a promise made to a people with real flesh, real blood. Keep those things in mind as you reflect on Genesis this week. Thanks. We'll see you next time.